Good morning and welcome to Rising. We have a glorious show for you today that truly captures the human spirit and the desire for freedom. It's a really artistic thing we have, and I expect it to be award nominated. What say you, Niall?
I was actually coughing anyway. I wasn't just choking on those particular words, but I'm sure it'll live up to all of your highest expectations. And you've got a little bit of a haircut there, Robby.
The commenters and viewers demanded it, and I give the people what they want. So I got a haircut yesterday.
Responsive to audience concerns. I like to see it. Well, in other news, what is on your radar?
Well, speaking of a triumph of human freedom, big news last night, Ross Ulbricht is a free man. Ulbricht received a full pardon from President Trump, who had made this promise to the Libertarian Party and its chairwoman, Angela McArdle, that he would, in fact, pardon Ross. This is a praiseworthy move for President Trump, and as someone who has long advocated for Ross Ulbricht to be released from prison, I am personally very grateful that Trump kept his promise and freed Ross on the first full day of his presidency. It's also a win for the Libertarian Party and its leadership, which met with Trump and lobbied him to pledge to pardon Ross in exchange for some level of implicit support from the party. Most of all, it's a win for Ross Ulbricht himself and for his mother, Lynn Ulbricht, who has worked tirelessly as an advocate for Ross's release for the last decade. I have met Lynn on many occasions, and I am so thrilled that her unfailing belief in her son's innocence has finally culminated in him winning back his freedom. It's also a well-deserved loss for a criminal justice system that sentenced Ross Ulbricht to prison for life based on an unproven accusation. Law enforcement officials did not like what Ross Ulbricht was doing. They didn't like that he maintained his innocence in the face of the most serious charges, and they punished him for it. They left him to rot in prison for a decade, but now the tables have turned. Now, some people probably watching are asking themselves, who is Ross Ulbricht? Why does this case matter? It's true that if you're a libertarian or involved with the Libertarian Party, you're probably already familiar with Ross's plight. Libertarians have long championed his release. For everyone else, let me give you some context. Ross Ulbricht was born in 1984 and grew up in Austin, Texas. He was influenced by libertarian ideas and thinkers from an early age and professed support for Libertarian Congressman and presidential candidate Ron Paul. Ulbricht eventually created Silk Road, an online marketplace based in some libertarian economic principles that operated in the dark web, allowing users to pay cryptocurrency for all sorts of goods and services, including illegal ones like drugs. Now, this did not sit well with the authorities, obviously, and they arrested Ross for running the platform. He was charged with narcotics trafficking, distribution of narcotics by means of the internet, narcotics trafficking conspiracy, continual criminal enterprise, conspiracy to aid and abet computer hacking, conspiracy to traffic in fraudulent identity documents, and money laundering conspiracy. Keep in mind that no one alleged that Ulbricht personally traded or sold illegal narcotics or profited from any sort of criminal activity. He was just the guy who created the platform where such transactions could take place. This would be like holding Mark Zuckerberg personally liable if he used Facebook Marketplace to sell cocaine. No doubt there are some people who do want to do that, but my question is, where does it end? Is the CEO of Verizon responsible if you talk to your drug dealer on the phone? But that's not all. Odiously, the government also asserted that Ulbricht was guilty of using Silk Road to hire mercenaries to kill people whom he feared were working with the authorities to ensnare him. This charge was never substantiated, however, and Ulbricht's defenders maintained that it's a vicious lie. One of the purported targets of the murder-for-hire scheme later said it was all BS invented by the government. He was not killed, nor was anyone else. This charge of murder for hire was eventually dropped, in fact. But by raising the issue in the first place, there's some reason to think the prosecutors motivated the judge to impose a harsher sentence on Ulbricht after he was found guilty. Ulbricht, of course, paid the trial penalty, i.e., because he did not accept a plea deal and instead maintained his innocence, the judge threw the book at him. He ended up getting a life sentence, served the next 11 years in prison. Now, my colleagues at the libertarian magazine Reason have written extensively about Ross's unfair treatment for years and advocated for his release. Here's a trailer for a documentary by my friend Zach Weissmuller going over some of these details.
This is a drawing by Ross Ulbricht, who is an inmate at the United States Penitentiary in Tucson, Arizona, a maximum security federal prison.
I'll spend the next few decades in this cage. Then, sometime later this century, I'll grow old and die. I'll finally leave prison, but I'll be in a body bag.
Ross was arrested at 29. Now he's 40. He faces a double life sentence plus 40 years with no possibility of parole for creating the Silk Road, a dark web marketplace that facilitated $1.2 billion in Bitcoin-denominated transactions. But a second chance might be coming from an unlikely savior.
And if you vote for me on day one, I will commute the sentence of Ross Ulbricht.
Trump made a deal with the Libertarian Party, and now Ross might not have to spend his middle and old age behind bars. He might not have to leave in a body bag if Trump makes good on his promise. Will he?
Now, today, President Donald Trump has made good on his promise. On this issue, at least, the Libertarian Party's strategy of appealing to Trump has paid off. I'm very happy about it. So this has been, Niall, an important cause for libertarians for a long time, and it was something that the chairwoman of the Libertarian Party, who I've interviewed on the show several times, actually did meet with Trump. Remember, he was invited to speak to the Libertarian Party, and the Libertarian Party still ran a candidate, but that candidate, who I've also interviewed on the show, feels that he didn't get a lot of support from the party infrastructure itself, which is more favorable to Donald Trump. It's kind of very, very interesting political strategy, but one of the arguments for doing that was to get exactly this outcome, the pardoning of Ross Ulbricht. So this is a promise that was made and kept immediately, and we're very happy about it.
So first of all, I think it is creditable to you and all the people who campaigned. And I've known people who were imprisoned, I thought, unjustly and in some cases clearly falsely, and that is an enormously traumatic experience for people. You mentioned that you've met his mother a number of times, and I think, I'm sure that's a difficult thing for her to go through. Aside from the issue of whether he did or did not, solicit somebody to murder people, which you have laid out, he's clearly not this is not someone who was ever convicted of violent crimes, so that obviously blunts any particular objection I have to his release. I think in cases like this, we were talking about this in a different context yesterday, how certain cases become kind of cause célèbres for different ideological tendencies or wings. So on the left, people like Leonard Peltier or Assata Shakur, and here in the Libertarian wing, Ross Ulbricht. I'm just curious about his case, and I'm not saying, he should be locked up forever, but just on a philosophical level, if you make something available that facilitates criminal activity, that is generally a crime.
Well, yes, to be clear, there's no doubt that he broke the law,
right,
with respect to the setting up this
so
platform where illegal. Now, we philosophically, libertarians, don't believe drugs should be illegal. I think you should be able to buy and sell even hardcore drugs. I totally support an end to prohibition and the legalization of drugs. But drugs are illegal. Now people consume drugs, it's illegal to do so in various contexts. It's conflicting city, state, and federal level. There's all sorts of different things. I don't think, and I'm obviously not speaking on behalf of him or the family, I don't think they really contend that he was innocent of creating he did create this platform. Now, he steadfastly maintains innocence from the murder aspect of it, and there's a lot more that I won't go into, and I'm not as clear on as a lot of other people who followed it closely, but that there were dirty cops actually involved in it as well, posing as various people, including perhaps people posing as him because it was an administrator. It was dark web, so it's very anonymous kind of activity. It's like, well, who actually is this administrator? And are there other people who were able to use the administrator title? That's getting a little bit far afield.
Yeah,
but yes, look, he did he's guilty of creating a platform where illegal drugs could be traded and sold. I don't think that should be illegal. It is illegal. He's served 11 years in prison for that. He could have taken a plea deal probably where he would have had maybe this amount of time or less, but because he wanted to make the philosophical argument that this shouldn't be illegal, went to trial and got, 2 life sentences plus 40 years.
Yeah, crazy. If the objection is to the sentencing, then I have no problem with
that's what we're talking about.
I guess, without getting it into too abstract an area, the idea that we decide that you or I don't think something should be a crime, which actually is a crime, that doesn't exonerate them. I have thought for years that prostitution should be legalized, but it's not.
Sure.
And so people who participate in it are still committing crimes.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're correct. I mean, obviously that logic can go, I mean, this, separate but equal as public services for white people and black people was the law, and people broke it, and we would say, well, you are breaking the law. It's just a statement of fact, but it's a good thing to break the law to well, how should I put it? To protest, to try to work toward changing this law, and I would hope laws around sex work and drug use, between consenting adults, it is not the business, generally speaking, of the states, is where probably we have a lot of agreement.
Absolutely. I'm sure we'll have disagreement later. Agreement on that.
Plenty of disagreement to come. Please stick around. Lots more today on Rising. President Donald Trump wasting no time to fulfill some campaign promises and purge the federal government. His administration, via an Office of Personnel Management memo, ordered that all federal employees with DEI jobs be placed on paid leave by 5 p.m. on Wednesday, and that all DEI offices and programs should be shut down.
The memo followed Trump's executive order, which overturned President Lyndon Johnson's 1965 order that established affirmative action and anti-discrimination protections. The memo also warned against disguising DEI programs using coded language, and it said that employees who witness this and fail to disclose the information within a 10-day period will face adverse consequences.
White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt wrote in a statement, President Trump campaigned on ending the scourge of DEI from our federal government and returning America to a merit-based society where people are hired based on their skills, not for the color of their skin. This is another win for all Americans, for Americans of all races, religions, and creeds. Promises made, promises kept.
Meanwhile, the Congressional Black Caucus responded to Trump's move, writing, "This executive order is nothing short of an attempt to take our country backward and does nothing to help our communities grow economically or address the costs of living for hard-working American families. This executive order is not only a broken economic promise, it stands in opposition to evidence which shows that diversity initiatives improve the government's ability to better serve our communities."
Earlier on Tuesday, the White House announced that the Transportation Department and the Federal Aviation Administration would stop DEI hiring practices and quote, return to merit-based hiring. In another move to pare down the federal workforce, the White House on Tuesday demanded that federal agencies list employees who are on a probationary period and recommend who should keep their jobs.
University of Michigan professor Don Moynihan wrote on Blue Sky, quote, "This isn't about woke government or DEI. It is removing civil rights era protections against discrimination."
On the other side, podcast host Megyn Kelly wrote on X, "It's like we went to sleep, woke up, and all of our dreams have come true." Babylon Bee managing editor Joel Berry said, okay, now it's time for Congress to pass these Trump executive orders into law. What's stopping Congress from enshrining Remain in Mexico or no DEI in government? We have both houses. What is stopping us? That is a good sentiment from the conservative side of things, because we don't want to create a reality where if we lose in 4 years, somebody comes in and just does executive orders reversing all this. Yeah. So I suspect we're going to disagree heartily here. But
well, on the merits of DEI, I suspect we are. But yeah,
yes,
go ahead.
We are. Look, I would say that this is certainly not about reversing non-discrimination. It remains the law of the land that you cannot have discriminatory hiring. The conservative criticism of at least aspects of DEI, sometimes it's not even clear what we're talking about DEI, but especially the hiring and if school admissions, that kind of thing, the conservative position, and actually I would say it's the majority position within the country, if you try to pass these things, even in like liberal California, they've often failed, is that the most qualified people should be staffing the administration, that it's not. It's also, if a private employer really wants to do DEI hiring, am I going to stand in their way? I think it's silly, but I guess I really don't care. It's your company, but this is the federal government we're talking about. This is our tax dollars being spent. I can't speak, I guess, for all of the American people, but it's very clear, I think, that Donald Trump ran on the platform of ending a kind of race-based consideration or other-based consideration in hiring. And also I disagree with, was that the Congressional Black Caucus saying that there's a lot of scientific evidence of benefits to these initiatives. I mean, that is simply not true. Maybe there's some evidence. There are also a lot of studies really calling into question specifically the implicit bias training module, which causes more consternation than it solves. But maybe some of these people were doing good work, as with our very contentious J6 conversation yesterday. I don't love blanket whatever. I would like it to be a case-by-case basis, but overall, I'm certainly satisfied with this policy.
So let me counter your criticism of the CBC by saying, quoting Megyn Kelly on diversity initiatives, so white Jesus lady herself is not necessarily the way forward in these respects. But look, there is, I think, a problem about the definition of exactly what is meant by DEI. Where I would defend it is in relation specifically to both hiring and to making employees from different backgrounds comfortable and welcome and feeling respected in the workforce. I know just from personal experience, if you talk to, the vast majority of women whom I know in the professional world or non-white people whom I know in the professional world have many, many stories to tell about where they believe gender or race resulted in them not getting credit for what they should have got credit for, not getting promoted where they should have done, not being valued in the way that they should have done. In relation to hiring, I do think DEI has a place in guarding against not only implicit bias, which can be a bit of a buzzword, but the propensity to simply hire from networks that the people in the companies already have, which tend to look or resemble them in demographic terms. So I think all of that is very justifiable. It is true that Trump ran on an anti-DEI platform, among many other things, and he won. I think that it is important to acknowledge the validity of his victory. I do not think that that means that people cannot dissent from those policies or object to those policies or argue against those policies. And to simply cut it all off from the federal government, where there is in fact some evidence, and I know it depends which study you look at, but there are some people who would argue that there are tangible empirical benefits to a diverse workplace, and that in the private sector, even companies that have diverse workforces do better.
Yeah, it depends what you mean by diversity. I mean,
I agree.
Actually diverse experience, life experiences which can be informed by characteristics like race and gender and sexuality, etc. Yes, can make you a more well-rounded or different thinking person, but then it would be that the characteristics are trying to get at a fundamentally more, the actual diversity, right? They're a stand-in for that. So if you're just relying on the surface characteristics, like you could end up, this is what colleges find, if you end up getting, just a bunch of, for instance, faculty with, different skin colors, but progressive groupthink, what's the difference? I also, I totally agree on doing outreach to groups that for whatever reason might not know about these opportunities, might be underrepresented for reasons of lack of hearing about the opportunities, but that so that is all fine, but then when it actually comes to the hiring or admissions decision, my view is that they shouldn't, and I would actually argue under existing law can't, although that's been litigated at the Supreme Court back and forth, they can't say, okay, well, you're a little less qualified than this person, but for reasons of race or gender or whatever, we're giving you a couple more points on our scale, and you get tipped up. That is what I think of a majority of the American people have said they do not want done in any context.
That may be true. I agree that it is important that diversity in fact means diversity. It is not just a stand-in purely for a small number of criteria. And one of the things that people were defending the DEI programs in relation to the federal government is not purely on the grounds of race or gender, but on things like having a multi-generational workforce, so people who are older, or for that matter younger, are not discriminated against, people who suffer physical handicap or impairment of some kind. It is important that the circumstances of offices and physical locations does not in effect bar them from employment. So I think all of those things are part of diversity too.
And in terms of going back to what you were saying a minute ago about the workplace or the classroom, whatever, being welcoming and accommodating and people getting overlooked or having some uncomfortable experience for a characteristic identity-based reason, of course that happens, and we have HR departments to deal with those kinds of things. It goes that way. It goes in multiple directions, though, right? Because there are also cases, we've read about them specifically when they pertain to media, because media cases end up being talked about.
Well, the media is fascinated by itself, right?
Of people also, weaponizing those kinds of processes to just, particularly in creative fields or editorial fields where there's a communications product, weaponizing that product, just that process against people they don't like or people they disagree with. Think of all the newsrooms having contortions about conservative opinions being published and saying, oh, this is triggering to me, usually weaponizing the language of the kind of campus set with trigger warnings and safe spaces. I think that has all died down a little bit, but there was a fever pitch for it where I thought that this is going well beyond trying to just make everyone, trying to have a successful and happy workforce and being like, I will use this system to destroy you.
That may be true, Robbie, but I always think there's a danger in using a extreme or unpopular example to discredit the broader effort. The New York Times, which is maybe one of the rows you're talking about, published that Tom Cotton op-ed, and people, particularly black employees, said that put them in actual danger or some phrase like that.
Right.
I thought that was a highly implausible claim. That does not mean that I therefore think all efforts to make workplaces more diverse and welcoming are therefore invalidated.
No,
I think there is a big
I don't either.
imperative to have the thing.
Yeah. All right, tell us what you think, and we'll be back with more Rising right after this. Trump giveth and Trump taketh away. First, the taking part. Trump revoked his former National Security Advisor John Bolton's security clearance yesterday.
Here's Trump discussing why he did that.
Why did he remove John Bolton's security clearance, sir?
Because I think that was enough time. It's we take a job. You take a job. You want to do a job. We're not going to have security on people for the rest of their lives. Why should we? I thought he was a very dumb person, but I used him well because every time people saw me come into a meeting with John Bolton standing behind me, they thought that he'd attack them because he was a warmonger. He's the one that got us involved, along with Cheney and a couple of others, convinced Bush, which was a terrible decision, to blow up the Middle East. We blew up the Middle East and we left. We got nothing out of it except a lot of death. We killed a lot of people. And John Bolton was, one of those guys, a stupid guy. But no, you can't have that for life. You shouldn't expect it for life.
Responded to the situation on X, writing in part, notwithstanding my criticisms of President Biden's national security policies, he nonetheless made the decision to extend that protection to me in 2021. The Justice Department filed criminal charges against an Iranian Revolutionary Guard official in 2022 for attempting to hire a hitman to target me. That threat remains today, as also demonstrated by the recent arrest of someone trying to arrange for President Trump's own assassination.
On the flip side, Trump has also decided to grant temporary security clearances to incoming officials who haven't fully completed the vetting process, citing a backlog of background checks.
A former intelligence official who spoke to CNN on background and who has worked on clearance issues said this could have negative consequences. He called it a, quote, dangerous thing, and said that foreign intelligence partners would be reasonable to restrict their intel sharing with the US.
Author and co-founder of Federal Clearance Assisted Service William Henderson told Newsweek that these kinds of expedited procedures do in fact exist.
To be sure, though, Henderson said that the White House seemed to have bypassed everything in the process. Podcaster Eric Erickson wrote on X, whether you like John Bolton or not, he played a role in wiping out a terror leader for Donald Trump, and a foreign government wants him murdered because of it. Our government should protect him.
Filmmaker and social media personality Mike Cernovich wrote, John Bolton, a private citizen, should pay for his own security. Trump has made the right choice. Jack Smith must also stop bleeding taxpayers. He can take care of himself. Fauci, too. So there are two things happening here. We discussed yesterday about John Bolton losing his security clearance alongside the 51 officials who had signed the letter saying that the Hunter Biden laptop story looked like Russian disinformation. This is now a step further. John Bolton is also losing his U.S. Secret Service protection, which he has had since, I believe, 2021, based on threats that Iran has made.
Because it was the killing of
two-way threats.
Right, it was the killing of Soleimani, I think.
Yes,
that
killing of Soleimani, yeah.
The threat, anyway.
Yes, so he is losing Secret Service protection. It's an interesting issue. Even though I heartily disagree with John Bolton, and I think he has been a terrible influence on the Trump administration and the Bush administration, constantly advocating for more war with Iran. He has been threatened by Iran. I don't think he should be killed or allowed to be killed, no matter how much I disagree with him, on one hand. On the other hand, well, we have a finite amount of security resources, as we've seen over this summer with Donald Trump coming under an assassination's bullet. We can't protect everyone indefinitely, so it is not necessarily unreasonable to me that there would be a end at which point you're not protected anymore?
Yeah, I think you and I both have a fair degree of distaste for John Bolton's foreign policy views and his propensity to enthuse about the likelihood of war, of bombing Iran, and so on and so forth. I think that is a separate issue from whether he has Secret Service or other security protection paid for by the government. If, as seems to be the case here, the threat to him emanates from something that occurred during his public service, it doesn't seem unreasonable to me that he should have that protection. And I think that that is different from saying, and this is to your point about the finite nature of security resources, I think that's different from saying, anyone who's ever been national security advisor gets a Secret Service detail for the rest of their lives. That doesn't seem viable. But in Bolton's case, it does seem specific to an active threat, and therefore I do think it's a little bit different. I was interested also in something that Trump said there, because it picked up on a point that we had discussed yesterday, which is what actually is, this is to do with security clearances rather than protection, what actually is the rationale for people having lifelong security clearances, especially when they are retired from public service in the intelligence agencies themselves? Maybe some of our audience can inform us why that exists, but it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense.
No, it really doesn't. Particularly that a lot of those people are going to end up serving on lobbying organizations for various foreign policy goals,
or in
perhaps
private roles,
advising foreign governments. You were serving in defense contracting roles, all of those sorts of things. Leveraging this information. Now, I think everyone should have access to a lot more of this information. Not truly classified information like the location of spies and that sort of thing. But I roll my eyes whenever the government says, "Oh, you can't know about this for some national security reason," and then it's like a grocery list or something. That's their attitude for this. So on one hand, I don't have more restrictions on what people can know, but to just have this class of elites and former government employees who have access to information no one else does, even when they're beyond serving in the government, it does not seem to make a lot of sense to me.
No, I think we're on the same page there. One area where we might be on a slightly different page is, I don't want us to forget about this thing where Trump apparently is issuing security clearances, or the Trump administration is issuing security clearances to people who have not gone through the vetting procedures. That seems harder to defend to me. It seems just as a matter of basic national security is even too strong a word, just as a matter of basic professionalism. I think you should probably have a vetting process before you're given a national security clearance.
Sure, I don't know what the rationale is from the Trump side of things, but I can agree with you. It seems like they should just wait till they go through their formal vetting and confirmation process, although I do truly expect everyone to be confirmed at the cabinet level.
Yeah. Well, I feel we've been unexpectedly fair to John Bolton here. Let's break right into
We don't like him, though. We don't like that guy and his mustache. Get that get that mug out of here. Lots more to discuss on Rising today. Please stay with us. Well, this Democrat sounds a lot like a Trump voter these days. New York City Mayor Eric Adams had this to say on Tucker Carlson's show. Let's watch.
People often say, well, you know, you don't sound like a Democrat, and, you know, you seem to have left the party. No, the party left me, and it left working class people.
Adams spilled the tea about his meeting with former President Joe Biden.
I spoke with the president himself. I spoke with the president first. Then the president came here to New York City. The governor and I sat down with the president, and I said, Mr. President, I'm not sure what they're telling you about this problem, but this is a terrible problem that's playing out on the ground, that we need to fix our border, and we need to just stop allowing people to come into the country with no destiny. We don't know what we're doing with them. And there was some that were coming here that were almost 6 months to a year, in some cases 2 years, without any work authorization. Like, what do you do with someone that cannot provide for themselves for that long period of time?
And the question on many New Yorkers' minds, will Eric Adams go to jail? Let's watch.
What's the potential penalty hanging over you?
Oh, no, this is real time. You could do 20, 30 years.
You could do 30 years
yes,
for taking flight upgrades?
This is real.
Do you wish you'd flown coach in retrospect?
Listen, look, you know, you can't live
Just
life.
bring your own food.
You can't live life in the rearview mirror. You got to live life in the front windshield.
Adams said he has offered an olive branch to the sitting president. Let's watch.
We talked about he loves the city.
Yeah, he does.
And we talked about, you know, how do we do things to work together to improve the city. And as I told everyone, I'm not here to be warring with the president. I'm here to work with the president, and everyone should do that. And you have the mayor of Washington reached out and said the same thing. After that, you have the governor did the same thing. People realize that you can't spend the next 4 years fighting. We need to spend the next 4 years listening to the American people. The popular vote, the electoral vote. We can't be bigger than the American people.
So, I have said this before, and
Yes.
it looks like I'm going to be saying this a lot more coming up.
Go ahead.
I think MAGA, conservatives, Trump people, should resist the temptation to just automatically accept anyone who, very late in the game, comes around and goes, oh, I love Trump, and I loved him so much, and now they're persecuting me because of my love of Trump. Democratic figures who get themselves into legal jeopardy are going to use that to trick you. Don't be that gullible. Now, having said that, look, he is entitled to due process. I do not, as a libertarian, this has been coming up a couple times recently, I do not just automatically accept the government or the prosecutor's case against people. They have all sorts of ways to make it look more impressive than it actually is. You know, I read through, I skimmed some of the indictment against him having to do with the flights being taken. We can hear his explanation. No, if it is just a matter even of a foreign lobbying group helping you upgrade your flight, even if that violates some kind of campaign finance thing, do I think you should go to jail for 30 years for it? No, I think you should probably just pay back whatever it costs. I generally think it is on the people to make decisions about who their political leaders should be rather than the criminal justice system, except in cases of egregious wrongdoing, you know, that gets into some of the Trump stuff. So I am perfectly happy to be persuaded that this is maybe, if not a nothing burger, like exaggerated or a little bit unfair, or a little bit of an effort to get him. Fine, show me the evidence of that and I will accept it. But in the meantime, I remain skeptical that what he is saying, and also that it's substantively true that he was trying to do things about immigration restrictions that conservatives wanted, and he's being thwarted by the deep state, and that's what's getting him. That seems very convenient for him to argue. Again, open to being persuaded. Conservatives out there, if there's some reason you've latched onto this and you think it's legitimate, let me know. I'm listening, but I remain a little cynical about it. I
am extremely cynical about not only Eric Adams' case in his own defence. We'll see how that works out when he goes to court, but about the interview that we just watched, because it seems to me just a classic example where each party gets something that they want, but the public isn't well served by it at all. So Tucker Carlson, as a conservative and as someone who is pretty closely allied with President Trump, gets a Democrat blasting Biden and the broader Democratic Party on immigration policy. And Eric Adams gets the opportunity to go on with a guy who's quite closely allied with Trump and essentially kiss up to Trump in the presumed or possible quest for some kind of pardon or clemency or leniency. Right. And to that point, I don't want to get too deep in the weeds here, but I watched that interview, and the way that Tucker Carlson frames the case at the start is just risible. He talks about the fact that Adams was, the problem was that he was allowing the president of Turkey to occupy his own building, or says that there was no evidence that the building in question was a fire trap. What this was, to tell it briefly, is in 2021, Turkey was building a new, very impressive building that included their consulate in New York. On the 9th of September, the FDNY guy in charge of fire prevention measures, or to ensure that fire safety standards were being obeyed, said that that building had some major issues, had more than 60 defects, and was not safe to occupy. Eric Adams, the following day, twice messages the FDNY commissioner. That afternoon, there's a meeting between two people in the FDNY who say that who believe they're going to lose their jobs if they don't do what Adams wants. And so there is a way found to open the building in time for the Turkish president arriving at the UN General Assembly, which is what the Turks wanted. All the while, Eric Adams allegedly is essentially on the take for abundant amounts of free travel, discounted flights, discounted luxury hotels from Turkish Airlines and other places. And there, in the government indictment, there is very considerable evidence that he and his aides knew they were doing something sketchy, because it is alleged, for example, that they tried to create fake paper trails pretending that Adams was paying the market rate for these things when in fact he wasn't.
Yeah, that all seems perfectly plausible to me. Now the government has to prove that case, and it still could be the matter of sentencing. You know, Rod Blagojevich is a kind of similar case, a Democrat who became very favorable to Trump and was ultimately pardoned for public corruption, was charged and convicted of sort of offering to sell off or wanting some boon for having making appointments, including the Senate seat to replace Barack Obama. You know, that was based on a lot of not good rhetoric, of kind of swagger on his part, being, you know, I'm gonna get something out of this, that the government used to make its case, that was an explicit, you know, promise for it makes me slightly uncomfortable, even though I think it's generally exuding an air of public corruption, and he was removed from office for it, but then he was in jail for what, like a decade, 8 years or something, and it starts to be like, well, it's 8 years for that. It's kind of,
yeah, you know,
that make sense to me. And we're getting into criminal and sentencing stuff a lot lately.
Sure.
I don't just like love people languishing in prison for years and years and years and years, especially for nonviolent offenses.
I'm making no judgment on if Eric Adams is convicted, what he should be sentenced to. I don't really have strong feelings about that. What I have strong feelings about is this narrative that he's the victim of political prosecution or persecution, which I just don't buy that at all.
I tend to agree. Stay tuned, we have more Rising right after this. While everyone was focused on President Donald Trump's inauguration, the global elites were gathering in Davos, Switzerland for their annual Schmooze Fest, the World Economic Forum.
German Chancellor Olaf Scholz gave a speech and discussed various topics at the annual Gabfest.
Scholz had this to say about free speech in Europe.
So, on the question of the dealing of Elon Musk, I had a lot of things to comment in the past, because he was discussing a lot about Europe. And just to repeat what I already said, we have the freedom of speech in Europe, and in Germany everyone can say what he wants, even if he is a billionaire. And what we do not accept is if this is supporting extreme right positions. And that is what I would like to repeat again.
Free speech around the globe has had an elevated focus since the election of President Donald Trump and his embrace of tech platforms. Many of them, including Mark Zuckerberg's Meta, have removed guardrails as to what people can and cannot say, even when that includes disinformation.
Science journalist Dr. Simon Godek reacted to Scholz's comments on X, writing, "Who defines what's extreme or extreme right-wing? Scholz himself, the same guy who pushes censorship laws, suppresses dissent, and labels anyone questioning the mainstream narrative as a threat to democracy. Classic socialist hypocrisy, freedom for me, but not for thee." And podcaster Ian Miles Chong wrote, "German Chancellor Olaf Scholz to Elon Musk, Europe's and Germany's freedom of speech cannot accept extreme right positions. No word on radical left positions." German lawyer and journalist Marcus Heinz piled on, writing, "Dear colleague Mr. Scholz, as a lawyer, you should actually know that right-wing positions and extreme right-wing positions are also protected by Article 5 of the Grundgesetz, our Constitution, freedom of speech, as long as they do not violate criminal law. Your statement towards Elon Musk show that you have either not understood the German law system or deliberately want to break the law." So it is frequently the case that we check in at Davos every year. And
Always.
There's some video of panels and events featuring high-profile world leaders and experts, and I'm always struck by there's always a X-person saying, yeah, free speech, but not hate speech, not extremist speech, not all of these things that may actually be illegal under various European laws. Here in the U.S., we include all of those things under the category of free speech. We have very limited exceptions for imminent threats of imminent, specific, deliberate violence. Violent inflammatory rhetoric still protected. It has to satisfy a really clear, you're making a threat against this person and at this time, and you're saying let's do this, and then it's rising to being not protected, or if it's libel or defamation, if it's copyright infringement. But we have much narrower categories than our friends in the Deutschland.
Well, or in Europe generally. I'm glad to be the voice of Europe, Rising's European correspondent on this issue once again. Look, I think that there is obviously, we have a fairly significant difference here in that I think there is a genuine public interest in avoiding obvious misinformation or disinformation, and I think that can be done without suppressing matters of opinion. So, for example, I can speak about the British example with greater authority than I can with anything to do with German domestic politics. There have been instances where the perpetrators of pretty heinous crimes in England in particular have been misidentified as sometimes named people or as immigrants, and that has contributed to literal riots in some cases, certainly to threats to people and all of that. There's no way of justifying that. That to me is completely different to someone expressing a heterodox view on COVID or on immigration or whatever. So I would defend that. In the case of Germany, it is obviously the case that Elon Musk has put his vast fortune, or at least a token amount of it, towards supporting AfD, which is considered by many people to be a very right-wing party. And we spoke about that yesterday. A lot of Jewish organizations in particular have serious problems with that party. It is also considered anti-Islamist in pretty public, blatant ways. So obviously I understand why Chancellor Scholz would have particular concerns about Elon Musk. You and I differ on the free speech area.
Yeah, well, look, I agree that obviously you should have the free speech right to counter disinformation and misinformation by using your own speech against it, by setting up media organizations that monitor it and counter it and correct it. It's when we get to the level of, well, what is the government doing about it? Obviously, I would agree that the government should and does, or law enforcement should and does, have power to stop rioting. Speech that very direct, there are edge cases, right? It's speech that very directly is causing, inciting a riot, yes, is something that even under U.S. speech law can be suppressed by or can be punished by government, but that gets into some murky territory whether your words are actually the thing causing it. Also, often you haven't made this argument, but I'll respond to it as if you have, because sometimes people on the left, when I've argued about this issue, will say, not even so much people on the left, because left people tend to be very good on free speech, even for dissident, extreme perspectives, but more kind of squishy liberal center people. will say that, well, we need, Germany, Robby, needs hate speech laws because look at their history. They actually had the Nazi takeover of their country, and so they specifically, it is okay to have more stringent laws against Nazi hate speech. And what I would say, and what other civil liberties-minded people would say, what my friends at Nadine Strawson of the ACLU has made this argument before, that, well, that doesn't really work because actually under the period of the Nazi rise in Germany, there were strict hate speech laws then against Nazi speech, prohibiting anti-Jewish speech. And in fact, you can argue that historically it backfired because it was a badge of honor for the burgeoning Nazi leaders, many of them whom Goebbels was, others were incarcerated for hate speech against Jews. And then they would say, they're suppressing the truth from you. They're afraid of us, and it made them more popular and more. It's the Streisand effect. That trying to suppress speech makes people go, oh, what are you trying to hide from me? So that's an ACLU person's perspective on why these are a very concerning thing to grapple with.
I mean, the German example and the certain bans that are in place there in terms of, giving Nazi salutes or showing Nazi slogans and so forth. I mean, those are laws that have been passed by duly elected legislators in Germany in recognition of that past. Whether it's effective or not, I'm not expert enough in current German politics to know, although I note with some dismay that the AfD is certainly on the rise. Just to give a brief, concrete example of this from a place that I'm very familiar with. Before I was born in the north of Ireland, there was a firebrand Protestant preacher and politician called Ian Paisley, who's now deceased. And at one time they had a meeting, a public rally, and he told a crowd of Protestant fundamentalist followers, or the quote attributed to him is, do you know who lives in number, whatever, 320? Pope's men, that's who, as in Catholics. And there was subsequently a riot. Now, to me, that sort of speech is an obvious example of incitement to violence or incitement to hatred. I would not cast freedom of speech concerns so broadly as to allow someone who says something like that to face no sanction. And I don't think, now we're talking in 2025 rather than 1968 or whatever that was, that people saying that sort of thing on social media should be exonerated from sanction.
Well, I would say, actually interesting that you say about the social media part. I don't know. I would have to more closely look at whether I think that, I mean, maybe it certainly violates the law in the UK. Whether I would think that violates the law under the First Amendment, I would have to study it more closely. But social media companies do not have to follow the First Amendment. They're private companies. They can say different rules. And one speech-related rule that tends to be very different on social media than what the First Amendment technically allows, which I agree with, is general prohibitions on doxing, on saying, here's where this person lives. Again, that's a restriction on free speech. I don't think if you shouted in the public square, Robby lives in this apartment building, do I think you could be arrested? I mean, I don't know. I don't think you could, and I don't think you should. But if you said that on Facebook or Twitter, I would say the company should take this down, and the company's policies are that they will take that down. So that is one way in which, as our speech moves on into privately controlled spheres, they can set different rules around speech. I think it's good to generally have a free speech maximal in accordance with the First Amendment environment, but no, I'm very strongly against doxing, sharing addresses, personal phone numbers. If you yourself have your contact info out there, then it's fine. But on that, yes, I think social media companies should continue to watch out for that kind of stuff. Yes.
Fair enough. A moment of agreement again. What's happening?
So we're making up for yesterday. Up next, has President Trump soured on Russian President Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine, and can he do anything about it? Stay tuned.
President Donald Trump pulled the rug out from under Russian President Vladimir Putin. Trump offered blistering criticism of Putin's leadership in Russia's war against Ukraine. Let's watch what Trump told reporters on Monday.
I have to speak to President Putin. We're going to have to find out. He can't be thrilled. He's not doing so well. I mean, he's grinding it out, but most people thought that war would have been over in about 1 week. And now you're into 3 years, right? So he can't be thrilled. It's not making him look very good. We have
numbers that almost 1 million Russian soldiers have been killed. About 700,000 Ukrainian soldiers are killed. Russia's bigger, they have more soldiers to lose. But that's no way to run a country.
Now, that struck some observers as different in tone from what he said 2 years ago about Putin. Let's watch.
I went in yesterday and there was a television screen, and I said, this is genius. Putin declares a big portion of the Ukraine. Putin declares it as independent. Oh, that's wonderful. So Putin is now saying it's independent, a large section of Ukraine. I said, how smart is that? And he's going to go in and be a peacekeeper. That's the strongest peace force. We could use that on our southern border. That's the strongest peace force I've ever seen. There were more army tanks than I've ever seen. They're going to keep peace all right.
So what impact will Trump have on Putin's approach to the nearly 3-year war between Russia and Ukraine? Here to weigh in is retired Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, host of the Deep Dive with Daniel Davis YouTube show. Welcome, Lieutenant Colonel.
Thanks for having me back.
So let's just immediately get your response to what President Trump said in those remarks, those new remarks about Vladimir Putin. What do you think?
Well, he's now, not just somebody from the outside just kind of weighing in, but now he's got the mantle of authority and the power, and now also the responsibility of bringing something in to fruition. And, as he said, really even in the couple of weeks before taking office, that he said, yeah, this is a lot harder than I think the Middle East, which ironically is in comparison, he thinks is less difficult, which just shows that he understands that this is going to be a lot more complicated than he had thought or hoped. And I think that what he wants to do is to just get this mess off the table in the least negative way possible, and then move on to things that are probably a higher priority for him. But it's not going to be easy because of the disastrous way the Biden administration prosecuted this war. He has a very weak hand for negotiations. And if anybody thinks that because he's got this great reputation as a deal maker, he's going to come in and create something out of nothing and to hand Ukraine and Kiev something that it can be happy with, I think they're going to be sorely disappointed, because I think the bigger risk is that Russia comes in and says, we don't have to negotiate anything. We can just keep fighting until we capture everything by force of arms that we want, which obviously makes the Trump side in a much more vulnerable position.
I think a lot of advocates for peace, for instance, in the Middle East, sympathetic people for the plight of the Palestinians, some were taken by surprise at the speed at which President then-elect Trump's negotiators were able to press Netanyahu to make a deal, the same deal that had been on the table for months, that he had rejected when Biden was in charge, and Trump was able to press him to do that, and is getting a lot of credit for it. Similarly, is it possible to press Vladimir Putin to accept some kind of deal, peace, etc., with Zelensky to bring this catastrophic war to a halt? Trump's instincts are in many ways what he said in his remarks on Monday. He used the word, world peace a lot. I think his instincts are very against war, certainly as a first resort, maybe more so than, frankly, other Republican figures have been in the past. But what does he have, in his negotiating toolkit to have Putin say, you know what, this has gone on long enough, here's what I want, and let's have it be done?
Yeah, well, first of all, you got to look at what actually did happen in the Israel-Hamas situation. And first of all, we don't really know what was agreed to behind the scenes from Trump's envoy there that got it done. But we do see that some of the comments coming out of the Israeli government have said that once they get their hostages back, that they plan on returning to the offensive, because they said Hamas is still not destroyed. So this could be just Trump's way of working with Netanyahu and saying, all right, we're going to give you some stuff, but I need something first. I said that we were going to, there was going to be hell to pay if the hostages weren't back by the time I came into office. I need that to happen. That has happened now. But it remains very much an open question of whether that war itself is going to be resolved anytime soon or not. So the jury's out on that one. In the situation with the Russia-Ukraine war, he has a lot less leverage for Vladimir Putin, because Putin has been very clear just in the last 24 hours of saying, yes, I'm happy to talk to the incoming administration. I congratulate Trump, but we have to address the core issues that are involved here, the core causes of this war. And he specifically said there won't be any ceasefire. There's not going to be any kind of pause in the fighting. We want a negotiated settlement to permanently end this. And that has to include all the things that we have said, which is all of the territorial acquisitions we annexed in 2022, which right now the Ukraine still possesses some of that. So they're saying until you negotiate away more land than what the Ukraine has already lost in the war, we're just going to keep fighting. And so that is, Trump doesn't really have any real cards to play on that. He said last night that if there's no ceasefire, he may use some sanctions. But really, at this point, what is sanctions going to do to Russia? I think they've seen that tired old play before, and it's not going to move them.
So if you believe that Putin has the advantage in a number of ways, including general advances on the battlefield, but also a greater reluctance of the United States to shore up Ukraine, or a lack of leverage on President Trump's part, does that mean that this just ends with Putin taking either all or most of Ukraine? I mean, how do you actually see this war ending other than an effective surrender to the Russian objectives?
Now, if you take the emotion out of it and take out of what we would like to happen and look at just the fundamentals and the power dynamics and the balance between the two sides that exist, that's pretty close to what we're looking at. Trump will have the opportunity, and the Russians are willing, because they do have a willingness and a desire to have a negotiated settlement. They would much rather take by diplomacy what they feel is their minimum requirements for their national security. But if they don't, they'll take it by force. And that's the real problem. There's no good solution here. There's no happy outcome. There's not even a good one from the side of the Ukraine side. We lost that opportunity in April 2022 in Istanbul, and in November 2022, when we now, according to the New York Times just a few days ago, know that former Secretary of State Blinken sabotaged a deal that could have resulted in a negotiated settlement at Ukraine's advantage at that time. So now then, Trump's just left with the Russian armed forces are significantly stronger than the Ukraine side is. The Ukraine side is now not even able to force mobilize enough to offset losses, which means they are literally being ground to dust, and there's nothing they can do to stop it. It doesn't matter if sanctions, it doesn't matter if Trump gives a bunch more equipment. The Ukraine doesn't have the manpower to even hang on. So you're either going to have a negotiated settlement that's to Moscow's advantage, or you're going to probably have an outright military defeat somewhere probably close to the Dnieper River, maybe even later in 2025. But I don't see any military way to avoid that outcome.
Well, then we would hope it would be, I mean, this is still not a great scenario, but if Russia truly designs to conquer the whole country, then Ukraine is going to say, well, then you have to conquer the whole country. You have to take it by force, and there'll be a lot more deaths on both sides. Perhaps they can have, yes, a negotiated settlement favorable to Russia, but short of the entire country going under Russian control. We hope Trump.
Well, but I'll tell you, the danger in that thinking, if that's what anybody in Europe is thinking, or Zelensky, is that assumes that their armed forces can continue to stay viable all the time they're shrinking down. But history tells us that there is some point to where the will to fight just collapses. And then if there's a physical breakthrough somewhere in the line, and Russia has the power to affect this, then the whole thing can collapse. And now all of a sudden you have no more armed forces to have. And you got to understand, from the perspective of the fighting man on the Ukraine side, why do they want to continue sacrificing their life to lose slowly? I think that's not a safe prospect if that's what Zelensky's thinking.
Lieutenant Colonel, thank you so much for providing your expertise. We appreciate it.
Always my pleasure. Thank you.
President Trump came out swinging against the LGBTQ+ community on day one in office. He signed a sweeping executive order preventing federal dollars from being spent on what his administration deems gender ideology. It also mandated that there are only two biological sexes, leaving no room for non-binary people. The order pledges to, quote, restore biological truth to the federal government. Federal agencies are directed to use the term sex instead of gender. And it also directs the Secretaries of State and Homeland Security to prevent trans people from self-selecting their gender in official government documents like visas and passports.
Among other directives, the Bureau of Prisons can no longer use federal funds on gender-affirming care, plus government facilities and workplaces will no longer be required to address people by their preferred pronouns. Many conservatives hailed these changes as positive and long overdue, but joining us now to dive into these stark policy changes is Brianna Wu, Executive Director of Rebellion PAC. She is also a trans woman and has all sorts of very interesting opinions, and I always like to hear from you. Welcome back to Rising, Brianna.
Hi, I'm so glad y'all invited me back on. I had such a good time last time. Circumstances not much better today, but we'll see how it goes.
We shall see. So let me get your reaction to the news we are hearing. And with one thing I appreciate about you is I think you really try to find common ground, and you have actually really fought with some of the activists on trans issues about areas where they are, reaching so far beyond public opinion on sports accommodations and bath and things like that. But, what about this stuff? What do you make of it?
So, I have a very unpopular opinion in the trans community, which is we have created the situation that is causing conservatives to have no choice but to go after us. We've taken something that used to be a private healthcare issue. And, back when I transitioned 20 years ago, it was really a private issue. Like people like me wanted to be empowered to make decisions about our own healthcare and really take responsibility for how people saw it. What I would call gender ideology in the last 10 years has externalized this problem. And instead of, trans women like taking responsibility for her voice or her looks or, electrolysis so she doesn't have a beard, we're like requiring the public to do all that work for us. So it doesn't surprise me that we're at this point. What I find so disappointing is this executive order is just so draconian. The reason conservatives were on board with a lot of these policy changes in the first place is they understood, like, if you give trans people a path to deal with their mental health issues, we can integrate into society and can be inobtrusive. Trump is essentially erasing our pathway for that. So I think if you're, saying things that make sense to me, like there are two sexes, that is true. I think if you're making it so a federal agency cannot accommodate transgender people that work there, I think that's too far, and I don't think that's where Americans are.
And so what should be done about that? I mean, obviously, President Trump is generally, I would say, prone to sweeping pronouncements, whether it's the trans issue, whether it's immigration, whether it's any number of things. And a president has significant powers, of course, under executive order. So is there any way that you see people might organize or move towards some kind of activism that could roll this back in any way?
I do. I've had many conversations with Democrats this week, trying to find a moderate path forward. I actually have a meeting in D.C. in a few weeks to have some conversations with some really important Republicans, and I'm going to try to find some common ground on that. Something I think is really important is, there was a New York Times poll that came out a few days ago that had the straight numbers on what the American people think of this mission that, I would call the trans fringe has been putting out there, including the ACLU and GLAAD, and they are just wildly against us. Like top to bottom, we're wildly losing at every single one of these initiatives. I think if you're serious about trans right, you've got to listen to what the American people are telling us, which is, this is too far. And you need to find a message that you need to find a more of a middle ground here. What does not give me a lot of hope is I'm looking at the way our quote unquote trans leaders are responding in this moment, and it's double down on the extremes, play the victim rather than evaluating like maybe is some part of this gone too far. So I think that what's going to happen is we need new leaders, and I'm trying to do my part.
Can we talk a little bit about the difference between sex and gender, which I think so often gets confused in these discussions? I don't really care what goes on the government form as a libertarian. I don't get really exercise what government forms say. I get, if there's a drop-down menu for everyone to pick their own exact specification, yes, it can get a little ridiculous. It should say man, woman. Should it say man, woman, transgender man, transgender woman, maybe other or something like that. But then when you, like, non-binary to me is speaking to like a gender expression kind of thing, which, like, why do they even need to know that and that category? Because I think some people on the right will say, and I'm kind of in this category, that like, well, you know, just putting on the costume of womanhood or a gender neutral costume or something doesn't change your fundamental biological reality in the same way that, you know, dressing like in a stereotypical Asian way or black way would make you that member of that race. But that you can't, but I obviously accept that transgender people exist and you can fundamentally change much aspects of your presentation and to manifest a different reality of who you are without just like, oh, I'm on a different costume today and now like I'm identifying a different way. Does any of this make sense to you?
No, of course it does, Robby. And yeah, for me, it's like, look, I will tell you flat out, I'm a nat'l male. I went to a doctor. I got health care. I got an estrogen that made my brain much, much better. And I had, you know, plastic surgery that made it easier to go through my life and not have the fact that I'm transgender come up all the time. You know, so I don't have any illusions about biology. I don't think the question, the public policy question is, you know, are trans women biological men? I think that answer is very clearly no. Or yes. I think, you know, the correct question is like, do trans women deserve civil rights? Like, what is the pathway to us being integrated into society? Yeah, I think this is really straightforward. You know, for me, I'm an old school trans woman. I transitioned. I went from being a drug addicted shut-in that was unable to have a job to, within just a few years, like a national figure, making really good money, hiring people, creating jobs. I think I'm a credit to my community. And frankly, I pay more in taxes than a lot of Americans like make in a year. Like, I am a success story. And part of that success story is government procedures that allowed me to address a mental health issue and move on with life. You know, me being trans does not need to come up every single day as I'm just walking through life. Are there accommodations we need to make, like trans women in, you know, women's sports? I don't think we belong there. I don't think a woman should ever see a penis in a locker room or a prison or anything like that. But I think if you're talking about implementing policy that just humiliates us and makes us second-class citizens as we go about our day, all that's going to do is result in a trans community even more neurotic, unhealthy, and unemployed than today, which is fairly terrifying.
And do you have any concerns, Brianna, that those sort of measures will increase actual harassment of trans people or of the trans community? Because obviously the danger, I think, in general, not only on this issue, is that when a very restrictive, or I think you used the word draconian, measure is passed, it can have the corollary effect of sort of validating bigotry, basically, or prejudice, or harassing behavior. So is that a concern you have right now?
No, I think that's exactly dead on. You know, and this is what happens is, you know, it's a tug of war between two extremist sides. You know, there was a Free Press story that came out this week that appalled me as a trans woman about the Biden measures to put men with penises that suddenly claim to be women who are sex offenders in women's prisons. And that horrifies me. I don't want to see that happen to women. Like, that doesn't belong there. That's an extreme on one side. But if you're going to the other side, which is, you know, saying someone that, say, has had vaginoplasty and passes very well, you know, has breasts, and if you're going to put that person in a men's prison, like, she's going to get raped and passed around to the point she's going to be traumatized for life and is going to get AIDS. So, yeah, the problem here is the problem through all of American politics, which is the extremism. There are public policy solutions, and it's really frustrating that neither the gender critical side nor the trans extremists are looking for it. So I need normal Americans to come on board and to work with me, because we do have answers for this.
And what do you think of the effect the activist community is having on these issues right now? And, you know, what arguments are you deploying to them to say that, hey, we got to try another route?
I think you need to tell them very plainly, this doesn't work. And Robby, what's so frustrating is they just can't hear it. You know, there was a Piers Morgan clip this week of me on there with Eli Ehrlich, who is a trans activist who set up, according to her on Twitter, a network to send hormones illegally to children without doctors in the loop. In confronting, her on this, she is incapable of understanding why this is a bad idea. Like, to say nothing of the legal culpability she's bringing on. Like, a lot of our leaders just are incapable of looking at this like adults. So I really don't know what answer there is other than for normal people, and especially normal trans people, to go, no. Actually, you don't speak for us. And Robby, I really think there are two sides to this here. You've got integrationist trans people that just want to get health care and go on with their lives. And you've got this gender ideology project. The gender ideology project is just seeking to radically rewrite sex out of law and externalize every part of this problem. So if someone is not read as a man or a woman, that is the public's problem. That's not the transsexual's problem. And it's a playbook that's so deeply un-American, it's obviously never going to work.
Brianna Wu, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Episcopalian Bishop Marianne Budde went on The View Wednesday morning, where she discussed her sermon in Tuesday's National Prayer Service, in which President Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance and their families had front row seats. Let's watch.
I think if you read what I said, and how could it not be politicized, right? We're in a hyper-political climate. One of the things I caution about is the culture of contempt in which we live that immediately rushes to the worst possible interpretations of what people are saying and to put them in categories such as the ones you've just described. That's part of the air we breathe now. And I was trying to speak a truth that I felt needed to be said, but to do it in as respectful and kind a way as I could.
To recap, in a rare public rebuke, the Bishop of the Washington National Cathedral, who you just saw there, gave a sermon and looked directly at President Trump when she said this.
In the name of our God, I ask you to have mercy upon the people in our country who are scared now. There are gay, lesbian, and transgender children in Democratic, Republican, and independent families, some who fear for their lives.
Budde then went on to say this.
The people who pick our crops and clean our office buildings, who labor in poultry farms and meatpacking plants, who wash the dishes after we eat in restaurants and work the night shifts in hospitals, they may not be citizens or have the proper documentation, but the vast majority of immigrants are not criminals.
President Trump has, of course, surrounded himself with fervent supporters, and a vocal challenge is becoming a rare commodity.
Trump clapped back and posted this. The so-called bishop who spoke at the National Prayer Service on Tuesday morning was a radical left hardline Trump hater. She brought her church into the world of politics in a very ungracious way. She was nasty in tone, not compelling or smart. She failed to mention the large number of illegal migrants that came into our country and killed people. Many were deposited from jails and mental institutions. It's a giant crime wave that is taking place in the USA. Apart from her inappropriate statements, the service was a very boring and uninspiring one. She is not good at her job. She and her church owe the public an apology. So here we are in this one. Look, I think there's no doubt that it was a political sermon. It spoke directly to liberal or democratic views on what the Trump administration plans to do in terms of protections for LGBT people and protections for immigrants or deportations of illegal immigrants. It was not just a let's manifest positivity toward people who disagree with us or the downtrodden. It got into very specific, concrete political terms. That doesn't sit well with people. Now, I don't think, Donald Trump is such like a special snowflake that he has to go around never hearing criticism or disagreement. He also could have opted not to attend this service with this person who is a well-known critic, liberal and critic of his policies. I'm seeing a lot of conservatives, including Matt Walsh, say whoever in the Trump comms people set this up to happen this way should immediately be fired. This is outrageous. They should have known that she's what he describes as a radical liberal, and it should have never happened. I don't care if Trump has to. He didn't have to. He happened to. It's not. It's well. He's got to hear people he disagrees with. She disagrees with them. I don't think it's the end of the world. Now, to hold her up as some kind of hero, and now she's going to be a newly minted View correspondent, and they're just like, oh my God, it was so brave and so wonderful. It's like, I don't know. Okay, that's
the High Bishop of the Resistance, Robbie. You're not relishing that kind of title.
Silly, yes.
No. Look, I think that there is. I have mixed feelings when church leaders involve themselves in politics because they're not elected by anybody, and they don't have any political expertise. And when, well, and also, I mean, not to get into a whole other area, but when the Catholic Church in particular starts pontificating on the morality of other people, given its history in relation to just abhorrent behaviour and complicity in the child sexual abuse stuff, I have very limited patience for that. And in fairness to Bishop Budde, she's in the Episcopalian Church. I think she would clearly argue that there is a moral imperative for church leaders to put forth these kind of ideas. In her defence, I do think that there are a lot of people in this country who are sincerely fearful of the Trump administration and what is to come in the next months and over the next 4 years. I think that in the migrant community, there is obvious concern about mass deportations, and there are a lot of people, for example, in families which have mixed immigration status. Some people are here legally and some are not. We were talking at another point during Rising today with Brianna Wu, who was talking about fears in the trans community about that sort of thing. So I do not think there is anything wrong with giving voice to those fears. I do think that casting the speech as a call to national unity is pretty obviously inaccurate.
Yeah, I mean, I'm perfectly accustomed to listening to sermons, homilies. I disagree with. I was educated in Catholic school, as most of our regular viewers know. I consider myself culturally Catholic, although not particularly religiously inclined. And sometimes especially when I went to at college at the University of Michigan, attending a church there as I did occasionally, and hearing the sermons from the very progressive Ann Arbor type priests was heard a lot of political things.
Did you lose your faith at the liberalism of the Catholic
No,
Church?
that was not the reason for that, but I did not agree with a lot of what I had to hear there. So I sympathize with Donald Trump on that front.
So where I sympathize with the bishop a little more is that I do think one of the reasons she has been sort of raised up by more liberal people right now is because of this perception that other people are bending the knee or being too acquiescent in the Trump agenda. And we've talked quite a lot on Rising about tech people and the Mark Zuckerbergs and Jeff Bezoses of the world, who certainly liberals feel, I think, have gone too far in a pro-Trump direction. And so to hear Trump called out in those sort of very clear moral terms plainly has a constituency. Do I think that now means that, Marianne Budde should set the direction of the nation? No, not particularly, but I think she's perfectly entitled to give her view and give it in that vigorous and clear way.
She is, and he was entitled to respond in kind, as he absolutely did. And we shall see if there are many more moments like that. That does it for us today on Rising. Thank you so much for watching, and be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we're now available anywhere you can listen to podcasts, and we will be back here tomorrow. Bye-bye.